Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you here today. Now, this is about the 8th gig on cookies I've done in the past week and a half, and some of you may have heard me speak on the subject before. So if I'm hashing the same old material, I apologise in advance, but unfortunately the law is the law, and it hasn't changed again in the last week, so it still should be pertinent. If I were a minister, I would start this by reciting a very large number of facts around the size of the internet and how important it is to the UK economy. Now, I think that's a given, but many ministers use one particular fact that we unearthed not that long ago, which I think is very pertinent, and that is that the internet is now larger in size than every book, every text ever written in every language ever, and that's every edition of every text and every copy of every text. And I think if you kind of conceive of that and the size of that, it's hardly surprising that things like privacy and the control of the data that we have of real importance to the consumers who use this huge, gargantuan thing that we call the internet. In fact, it's difficult for anyone who's looked at a newspaper in the past week and a half to underestimate the importance that people, and indeed now politicians, attach to privacy. And I think one key message that I should give to you is that is not going to go away. The importance that politicians and policymakers attach to privacy is here to stay. This government, in particular, made clear its commitment to tackling privacy concerns some time ago, and in fact there was a line in the coalition agreement that set out that tackling privacy concerns would be a priority for the government. Now, it's taken some time for us to do our thinking about that, and we think broadly there are 4 areas that need to be addressed. Now, one of those is what we as citizen publishers do with the information that we upload onto the internet. The second is around the security and quality of data processing. The third is perhaps the information that is then extracted and used from that information that we upload. So, cookies, effectively. And the fourth is increasingly around do not track. How we know, or how publishers and providers of service know where we are, what we're doing, and what our preferences are. Now, as a government, we recognise entirely that the internet is important. It's absolutely crucial for growth. We recognise also that there are burdens that cannot be placed on business if we want a vibrant and world-leading ICT sector. So our approach to tackling privacy concerns is to be, wherever possible, pragmatic, to be collaborative, to ensure that our goals are realistic and they actually tackle the concerns that people have. And we think that the way to do this is to work with industry, to work with our other stakeholders, to ensure that the approaches that we do adopt in final policy terms work for you, that they work for the sector, and that they are world-class. Because one of our key concerns is that if what we do isn't good enough, then Europe will move separately, and we'll end up with heavy-handed but well-intentioned legislation, like the cookies provision, that doesn't do what it's actually intended to do. The key aim, I think, of all our policy on privacy, and some of this will become clearer as I talk longer, and indeed as the year goes on and policy is revealed, you'll see its intent, is to ensure that users have more information and more control over their data. I think we should also recognise that that was perhaps the key aim of the e-privacy directive. The fact that it doesn't do that is by the by, but that was its aim. And if we're talking about compliance, that's what we should aim to do, is to comply with the spirit of the legislation and what it was intended to do. Because, be under no illusion, there will be new legislation emerging from Europe that tries to further that. So the best part of the last year has, for government, in terms of privacy, been taken up with the implementation of the e-privacy directive. Now, that piece of legislation first emerged in 2003 as a policy proposal in Europe. It was implemented that year. It was renegotiated in 2009 off the back of experience to make it more pertinent and relevant to technological change, and came into force this year in 2011. Now, we consulted long and hard on our proposals. We first put them in the public domain back in September. We've been talking to stakeholders prior to that, and we think that our policy approach is perhaps the best in Europe. It's certainly the only approach in law in Europe, but others will follow behind us. Now, that approach, to recap, has been to copy out the wording of the directive, so it's quite clear that in law the UK complies. It's also been to make clear that where the use of a cookie is strictly necessary for the provision of a service explicitly requested by the user, that no consent is needed. We've also made reference to browsers to enable enhanced browser settings to be used to meet the requirements of a directive. Now, why not browser settings as they stand? Well, the answer to that is simple. The European Commission has been clear that the text of a directive has changed substantively, and that means that the practice of implementation has to change substantively as well. This means that browser settings as they stand do not constitute consent. We also said that we'd champion and support the work that has been done on the use of third-party cookies in online behavioural advertising, and we have done that. We've championed it in Europe. We talked the European Commission behind the scenes into adopting this as approach for this highly contentious use of cookies. We think it is an exemplar of how consent might be arrived at and obtained. We also think it sets a benchmark for a form of obtaining consent that is not obtrusive, that enables the net to continue in its current form and doesn't impact unnecessarily on the user's experience of surfing. We also decided that there was no way in the world that companies could possibly be compliant on the 26th of May. Government, for one, is not compliant. Although a lot of work has hastily been done on the DCMS website last week, it's still probably not quite there, although we're trying to ensure that it is. So we've told the Information Commissioner that it would be sensible to allow a grace period now of 12 months to enable businesses and other organisations to make sure that the use of cookies complies with the law. We've also tied that to our own work on enhancing browser settings, and over the course of a year we'll make a series of public announcements as to how that's progressing. We also said in our approach, which we published back in April, that we would look to work with other industry stakeholders to champion and support other approaches to complying with this legislation. Now, we've yet to start doing that in any real detail, but we will do so because we think it's quite clear that a one-size solution does not fit the UK. It's, frankly, irrelevant to Europe as a whole. So that's our approach. Now, many of you will heard and will have seen a large number of newspaper articles criticising consistency between government and the ICO. Let me say categorically that that was not the case. For anyone who was either in government or in the ICO, the approach has been one of absolute unity. Now, certainly, there are differences in expression. Now, of course, that's the case. One is a legislator, the other is a regulator. We have written the law. The ICO will be implementing and enforcing that law in due course. They are not in a position to be able to say that what exists now will be compliant going forward, hence a certain ambiguity around some of the language in their advice. However, what is clear is that they have set out how compliance might be achieved by different organisations and in different ways. That means a bespoke section on the use of third-party cookies, particularly as used in behavioural advertising, some advice for small businesses on how they might set out how they might set out to obtain consent. What also needs to be said, and this is said in the note that DCMS produced earlier last week, is that this notion of consent has caused a great deal of confusion. There is some wording, some legal wording, that seems to imply that consent has to be obtained prior to the serving of cookies. Now, that's simple wording. The definition of consent is not prior consent, it is informed consent. It's quite clear from the Data Protection Directive, where the definition of consent actually lies, that consent can be obtained either during or after processing. There is no need to obtain consent prior to the processing of data or the serving of that cookie. However, what is also clear is if you are asking for consent, best practice might be to do it first if that is practicable. Clearly, though, privacy doesn't end with the implementation of the e-privacy directive. The cookies legislation, as I think I've alluded to, was well intended, but doesn't really do what was wanted by legislators, which is to extend the control and the information given to and provided to consumers and users. It will be addressed again in the forthcoming review of the Data Protection Directive. And that means that if we want a pragmatic and light touch approach to the overall privacy regime, we have to develop models that work now. So this is why when the government works with browser manufacturers, we're not simply looking at enhancing them for the purpose of cookies. We're looking at tackling privacy concerns more widely. That means building on the do not track functionality now often seen in American browsers. It means also perhaps making it very clear how you can remove your data and how you give the consumer that control over the removal of that data. There's a very good website that's been developed by the Norwegian regulator called deleteme.no that provides the consumer with all the information they need to delete their data. If we have systems like that in place, we don't need to worry about proposals for the right to be forgotten that Vivian Redding has spoken about. We don't, if we as organisations and firms treat people's data with the respect that it is due and is required by the spirit of the law, then we don't need to worry about jurisdictions and European proposals to make European law enforceable in the US and elsewhere in the world. So what we are going to do as a government is set out our approach to privacy more widely. Now that paper will be due later this year. It will also be supplemented by a wider paper on our approach to the internet as a whole. That will set out our red lines for negotiation in the forthcoming review of the Data Protection Directive, and also set out what we want to ensure European businesses can do going forward. That means taking advantage and full advantage of data transfer. That means seeing data holdings as an economic resource. That also means ensuring that European firms can use the cloud, for instance, and take full advantage of the profound opportunities that cloud-based business models offer without falling foul of data protection legislation. So in terms of final messages, what are they from government? One, I guess, is to ensure that you are complying with the spirit of the law going forward. We are where we are. No one wanted this law in the form that it now exists. We think as a government that we have done a hell of a good job in making sense of that law and ensuring that businesses aren't in any way detrimented by the implementation of it. We'd also say don't panic, you've got 12 months. But during this time also please work towards your use of cookies. And given the audience, I guess I should probably say that we see compliance being intrinsically linked to the intrusive nature of the cookie that is served. So in terms of web analytics, does anyone, in terms of users, actually care about them? No. Answer is clearly no. They enable me to use my website without difficulty. So what are we asking from you in terms of web analytics? And it's provide that bit more information. Maybe make the effort to obtain consent. But it's not web analytics that are the issue. It's the more intrusive cookies and the data that has been extracted from the use of cookies for other purposes where real efforts should be made to obtain the actual consent of the user. Anyway, I think that's probably 10 to 15 minutes worth.
Good, yeah.
Excellent. Then on which I will thank you for your time, and I'll answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.